Hi, welcome everybody. We are here today for a Q&A on flow, predictability, and all that jazz that goes along with it. And I'm Julia Wester. I'm the CEO and co-founder of 55 Degrees. We're a product company that focuses on apps that help you be predictable, be confident, and be more agile in actions, not just words. And I want to introduce Dan Vacanti. He is someone that we work with quite closely. He was the original creator of one of our projects, ActionableAgile Analytics. He is still the face and owner of that brand, and a lot of things are going on with that brand. And I want to give him a minute to just introduce himself and what's happening, and then we'll start talking about what we're doing here today. So Dan, why don't you let us know a little bit about you and what's going on?
Thank you, Julia. So started ActionableAgile back in 2013 or 14, whatever it was. Was lucky enough to start partnering with Julia. We just looked this up. I think we started partnering in 2019, 2020? 2019, I think it was.
2018 or 19,
2018,
yeah.
whatever it is, yeah.
Yeah, something like that.
Should we talk about the big announcement now, or should we save that for later too?
Let's do it now so people
Okay.
can be thinking about all that, gathering their mental juices.
So I was going to say I have a new book coming out, but I just did a soft launch of it on LeanPub this morning. So in the coming days and weeks, we'll have a lot more information about, how to buy it. It's only available on LeanPub right now. The plan is to put it out on Amazon probably early next year. So you can get a Kindle version. If you use Kindle, you can get a Kindle version on LeanPub if anybody's interested. If you want a print version, though, that's what's going to need to wait until early next year. But we'll probably have some codes going out, some coupon codes going out for Actionable Agile customers.
Yep.
And things like that. So watch your inbox, watch social media, watch all that stuff for coming news about the book.
Yeah, you're actually doing this in an agile sort of process, right? You've been iterating on the content, getting feedback, and now you're putting out the digital version, getting more feedback, getting better images and stuff. And then when everything is even more, there, you're going to put out the print copy. And I think that's a really good example of how we should be working, like making things easy to change until we're pretty confident about how they are. We'll talk a little bit about the 55 Degrees community if you're not already there, because we're going to have a community events for launching Dan's book. So we'll talk about that when we're done answering people's questions about flow, predictability, and forecasting. If you haven't been to one of these before, this is a sort of an interactive kind of event that we have. So Dan and I, or whoever guest we have today, with us today is Dan. We're here to answer your questions about flow, predictability, forecasting. You can enter those questions into the Q&A panel of the webinar. And as they come up, when we get to a point where it's appropriate to answer that question, we're going to dive in and try our best to give you value, help you answer that question that you've had niggling in the back of your head. It's okay if you don't have any questions right now, because we're going to talk a little bit. We're pretty good at that. That's why we like to hear ourselves talk. Because we want to give you some time to get those questions formed and let you sort of bounce off some things that we start talking about that might generate questions. But if you already have a question, please go ahead and enter it there. And we have people helping us make sure we get to those in case we sort of get lost in our own conversation. So we're going to let you do that. And while we do that, I'm going to ask Dan to sort of get us started. What's an interesting question that you've had recently about this area that might be fun to talk about together?
Yeah, just had one come up I think it was last week, about CFDs specifically. And it's great and bad from a couple of reasons. I haven't actually heard many questions about CFDs lately, which I think is generally a good thing. We can talk about whether that's a good thing or not, actually. But anyway,
you used to be the CFD man. And for those of you not in the know, I'm going to make sure we define all of our acronyms. Cumulative flow diagram. Take it away, Dan.
Yeah. So, and and that is fair. Technically, I think I still am kind of. I'm a huge CFD fan, cumulative flow diagram fan. I'm not necessarily a fan of how it's spoken about much in the industry. But anyway,
Yeah.
the
Okay.
question was, um, uh, for those of you who are not familiar with I have a drunk agile podcast that I do with Pratik Singh, and we had done an episode on cumulative flow diagrams. I don't know, a year or two ago. And in that episode, we talk about how you cannot see bottlenecks on a cumulative flow diagram on a CFD. And the question came in, and they were like, "Well, I've always been taught that you absolutely can see bottlenecks. Like that's the whole purpose of a cumulative flow diagram is to spot bottlenecks." And he's like, I'm really confused. You're saying I can't see bottlenecks, but that's what everybody tells me that you're supposed to do with a cumulative flow diagram. So I don't know. Do you want me to start by answering that? You want to take a shot at that
Well,
first, Julia, and then
well, I wanted to add in that I'm sort of with this guy, right? Because I had always been shown that, for those of you who aren't sure what a CFD looks like, it's basically an area chart. So you see like a colored band for each part of your workflow or each column on your board. And over time, as more items go through that column on your board, that column, that area grows. So you can see how things go. And you can also see days when nothing was in that column and days when lots of stuff was in that column. So you can imagine how columns might bulge and shrink, and those are sort of visual indicators. So when the column bulges, when that area bulges, I had always been told that that's probably some kind of, well, not always, but there's a potential bottleneck there. It could be that you're doing some big batch for some reason or something like that. But yeah, so I would have said too, oh, yeah, I think you can see bottlenecks in CFDs. So why can't you see bottlenecks in CFDs, Dan?
great. Well, so first of all, I'm going to follow Julia's lead, and I just want to make sure that we clarify some terminology before we get too deep into this. Before I start getting
Yeah.
a bunch of hate mail. Um, we are when we talk about bottlenecks here, we're talking about bottleneck with a small b. This is, to me, this is very, very different. I think it's clear to point this out. This is very different than, say, a constraint, a systemic constraint that you might hear for about theory of constraints. The word bottleneck is not synonymous with constraint, in theory of constraints. So we're just talking about the small b bottlenecks. We're not talking about capital C constraints. If you want to learn more about constraints and theory constraints and things like that, I would go recommend Steve Tendon's work on Tameflow. He's written a bunch of great stuff about that if you want to learn about that. But I want to finish this part of the answer by saying you absolutely cannot see a systemic constraint on a CFD. If you can't see a small b bottleneck, you absolutely cannot see a systemic constraint on a cumulative flow diagram. So let's talk about the small b bottleneck now, because that's what we're here for. And this is very timely, because this is something that I talk a lot about in the new book, is this idea of variation. And maybe I should define that very quickly. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what process you're operating. It doesn't matter what data set you're looking at. Whatever you're running, all of these things will suffer from this notion of variation. What I mean by that is there are changes over time in how your process operates, and more specifically in the data that you collect, right? So if we think about cycle time, it wouldn't be reasonable for you to think that every item that goes through your process is going to take exactly the same amount of time, right? It's not only is that impossible, but you wouldn't want that to happen even if you could get it that way, right? From item to item, there's going to be just changes in in the amount of time it takes to get those things done. The same is true of all of our flow metrics. If we talk about throughput, if we talk about work in progress, if we talk about, like I said, any data set you want to look at, there are going to be small variations in those values over time. And so when you look at a cumulative flow diagram, that's really all you're seeing is a qualitative, and hope I can say, qualitative, not quantitative. We're not talking about hard numbers.
Qualitative.
Yeah, I just waved my hands. What we're seeing is just qualitative variation in flow over time. So it's next to impossible. I don't want to say it's impossible. I have to think about that for a second.
You might
But
get lucky.
Yeah, yeah. But it's generally speaking, exactly right. It's generally speaking not reasonable to think that you can look at just those qualitative variations in flow to say, hey, that's a bottleneck, because we have to expect variation in flow over time. So to really understand if there is a bottleneck, you'd have to go look at the data, you'd have to go look at your context, you'd have to go do a whole bunch of other things in terms of investigation. And a cumulative flow diagram might help point out where those investigation might go. But as Julia said, just because I have a bulge on a cumulative flow diagram or I have a constriction on the that may not be where the problem is. In fact, it's usually not where the problem is. The problem's usually somewhere else. And that's the investigation you have to do to find out really where that bottleneck is.
Yeah, I guess it could be even further downstream, and that's why you're seeing things back up there. So I guess it's a thing to have a conversation, which is what most of our metrics are, right? It gives us indicators that make us go figure out what story they're telling, storytelling device in a way, almost, I guess. I want to ask people again, if you have questions popping up, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. Until then, Dan and I are going to just spin through questions that we've been asked recently. And if you're getting value out of that, great. But don't lose the opportunity to get your question answered. Okay, Dan. Today we had a question from a person who told us that they were using a Monte Carlo forecast to understand when they could finish a small number of items with, a segment of their work. So let's say these are work items with a component awesome, right? And all their items with component awesome only take a couple of days to finish. Their cycle times are like 2 days or less, but for some reason, their Monte Carlo forecasts are telling them it's going to take them a few months to get a couple of these awesome cards done. Do you want to give people who may have those same questions? I know what I answered this person, but what would you tell this person?
Well, I'm on the edge of my seat. I'm really
You're
curious
going
to
to
hear
throw
what
it back to
yeah,
me?
I mean, yeah,
Okay.
no, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
now that you've spun it into something, I'd love to hear what you say.
Yeah. Okay, well, and while all of our work is awesome, what I said without knowing any more context about that person's data set is that it might very well take you 2 days or less to do awesome, component items, but how often are you finishing the awesome component items? Because if those are only finishing very rarely, it doesn't matter how long they take to get done, because cycle time isn't the metric that matters most when it comes to forecasting multiple items. Instead, we need to know your throughput, or the rate at which you're finishing items with component awesome. So if you're only finishing one of those every few weeks or months, even though they only take 2 days or less to do, then that forecast is going to be right. That it's going to take quite a while for you to accumulate enough of those done to say we got 2, 3, 4 of these things done. And because I got to be awesome and get a sneak peek of Dan's book, you do talk in your book about forecasting when you have very uneven data. Think Scrum teams that have 0 items delivered most days, and then lots delivered on like 1 or 2 days in the sprint. And that does, it can make your forecast look very far out. What would you add, when people are taking that example of what we told her and trying to, apply it into much more common situations like this with Scrum? You want to give people a little sneak peek of the kinds of things they can find in your book, like specifically about that question?
Yes. And if I maybe talk about the kind of the first thing that you said there too,
Yeah.
it's a subtlety. It's kind of a nuance of forecasting that I know Julia reiterates all the time. Certainly, I talk about it a lot, but you have to really know when we're talking about forecasting, you have to really know what type of forecast you're being asked for, and if you're asked for, we talk about differences between forecasts for multiple items and different forecasts for individual items. If you're being asked for a forecast for multiple items, hey, how many things can I get done, right? Or I've got 100 things that I want to get done. How long is it going to take for those things to get done? Right. If that's a forecast for multiple items, that's when you should start implying the flow metric or throughput, Monte Carlo simulation, and things like that as an option, right? As probably your first option. For individual items, especially in these rare events, when we talk about, hey, I've got these awesome items, but I'm only getting a couple of those things done. First of all, I might wonder if only a couple of those things are getting done every couple of weeks or every couple of months or whatever it is. Maybe really all you care about is, a forecast for a single item in that case. It's like, hey, when we pick up an individual awesome item, well, we can look at cycle time, because if we're talking about forecasts for single items, we can look at our cycle time for those awesome items and say, okay, hey, when I pick up this awesome item, we expect it to finish in 3 days or less, 70% of the time, whatever that is. That might be good enough for the context. Maybe you don't care how long is it going to take me to get 100 awesome items done because they only show up once every couple of weeks. That might be one thing to think about.
Let me run this back to you. So, because I think there's something there. Funny, right? Okay, so depending on the question you're being asked, if we use the Monte Carlo to answer that question, it's basically saying, given the rate at which we normally start these things and normally finish them, then here is when 5 of these awesome items are likely to be delivered. So if I'm stakeholder for awesome component, that's a valid answer to me. But then to your point, if I don't like that answer and I want to do something about it, it might also be good for me to know how long it takes for us to finish an individual awesome item, because then I can go advocate for starting them more often, or, putting them in progress more often, and not at the rate that we've always done that, because we're basing that forecast that we're going to continue to work on these at about the same rate that we did before. So if you don't like that forecast, you either, you got to find a way to finish more of them in a given time. Because if I told this person it's going to take me 3 days or less, 85% of the time, to do an awesome item, they still need to know, if they're trying to figure out when 5 of those are going to get done, they still need to know the answer about, well, how often, because it's not going to be like 15 days, because they're not going to do all of those at one time or right after another, unless we change our practice. So you made me think of it in a way I hadn't quite thought about before, is that you can give people the answer of how it would happen if nothing changes, but then you can give them information to help them implement change or motivate change to meet their needs. So, or advocate, that's the word that I was looking for. So what could they do to advocate a different rate of working on that? So that was an interesting sort of way to think about it that I hadn't quite thought about before. So.
Yeah, and you're actually taking us down the path toward like maybe a prioritization conversation, and things like that, which we didn't necessarily have scheduled for this call, but
No.
if anybody wants to talk about prioritization, I know I have strong opinions about prioritization. I think Julia has some great insight about prioritization as well. So if anybody wants to talk about that, that's certainly something we can say. But anyway, getting back to, I think, Julia's second question, although I know there's like one question in 50 parts.
I know, I need to do better. I'll work on that, Dan.
Julie was asking, okay, but what about this case, like for any team, Scrum or otherwise, that it's like when you look at their throughput, it's 0.000000000 20. It's like they get, the team gets nothing done, and then at the end of a sprint, at the end of a release, at the end of just any time box, they just complete everything. And as Julia rightly pointed out, that's really going to kind of screw up what your Monte Carlo simulation is going to look like, because it's going to assume that 99% of the days you're getting 0 done, and then just one day you're getting 20 things done. So it really is going to have the effect of just artificially stretching out the time horizon that forecast is going to give you. So what can we do? Well, I think the first thing to do is just kind of visualize that data and we have right now we have something called a throughput run chart. That's the place I would start. We're going to be enhancing that functionality.
Mhm.
I know early next year. I don't know. Is that
Yeah.
is that what we're looking at?
Yeah.
To maybe even give us more information from. But just if you just even look and say, hey, look, the reason our Monte Carlo looks so screwed up is because of all these zeros. The very first step is to talk about what can we do to make that flow just a little bit more consistent. And I'm not talking about making sure that we're finishing stuff every single day. Although if Pratik Singh was on here, he'd be saying you need to finish stuff every single day. I'm not necessarily saying that. I'm just saying instead of having the majority be zeros, have the majority be stuff where we are getting things done. I'd want to look at process improvements or changes or whatever you can do so that we can get stuff done the majority of days. And this might be things like process changes. I don't know. Were you going to jump in and say something?
No, sorry, I just cleared my throat.
Yeah, it might be like a policy change. Maybe the reason that 20 things get done all at the same time is because we've got, a sign off that needs to happen. And the person who has to do the sign off is only available once every 2 weeks. And so we just queue up 20 things. And then when this person's available, they just sign everything off. Well, can we tweak that policy? Do we really need to have, that sign off? Can somebody else do the sign offs? Certain things like that will make your flow a little bit more consistent. Again, we're assuming that what you care about is predictability, which I think that's what you should care about.
Well, if you're on this webinar, you probably do care.
Yeah.
But, disclaimer, it's not always going to be your only consideration. I think we should just have a floating disclaimer above all of our talks about this stuff, but it's one that we usually ignore way more than we should. So it's worth being extra talky about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that would be the first step. If that is your context, that yes, we have a bunch of zeros with a bunch of stuff finishing all at the same time. Then there's some other things we can, and it's probably I don't know. I don't know if we can get it's kind of hand wavy and kind of mathy. So I don't know how much.
Well, it's in the book too, right?
Yeah, I was going to say I don't want to say just read the book. I didn't want to say that.
I'll say it for you.
I think that's got to be the answer. Is there's
too
some,
technical for talking. Right?
Some mathy things you can do to kind of smooth that data out and that's even bad terminology. But
yeah.
At the end of the day, your best bet is going to be to try and get a little bit more consistent flow because that's what's going to drive predictability.
Yeah, and that made me think of something too, that sometimes we try to, we have a problem and there's a couple ways that we can go about it. Say the prioritization problem, right? And so, or even the estimation problem, like we're trying to get realistic estimates. And we can spend time continually trying to build a better and better model of all the super complex stuff that happens and influences how long it takes to get work done. We could do that, try to work on that till the day we died, and we'd never complete that, but many people still try to do that. Or we could work at ways to make our data work better for us, and so that we don't have to spend that effort. And a lot of people call that, there's a bad rap of trying to adjust your process to a tool instead of adjusting the tool to your process. And I think that's very valid in a lot of cases, but sometimes we have to sit back and think, if I did adjust my process to this tool, then would I be better off? Because sometimes constraints are there to help you get better, and you're much better served by doing things to make a more predictable process than by trying to come up with more and more ways to figure out the unknown about the craziness that's going on in your process. It's like, which way should you spend your time, because it's very limited. So that sort of makes me think of that.
Yeah.
Also, yeah, when we go back and we say, don't try to, like, when people are forecasting and they're over focusing on like one single thing about work, like the story point value or the t-shirt size or the monetary value, or I don't know what, but monetary value doesn't affect how long it takes to get stuff done generally, but insert any answer into that blank. And that alone is never going to give you all the information you need to know how long stuff is going to take to get done, because so many things impact us, from break times to how bad you slept that night, if you had a fight with your spouse, or, someone else getting sick. You just can't model it, but your data happens because of all of that. And so we could stop trying to fight it and make a model, or we could say, our data was generated by our process. It models what our process can output, right? It's up to us to make sure those outputs are valuable and, repeatable and all of that. And thus we improve the process to get better outputs from that process. And that's just a much more virtuous circle than spinning our wheels trying to make crappy things better, like to improve crappy tools that were never good tools to focus on in the first place. I don't know.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? That was a bit of a soapbox.
No, it's great, because I was just going to say our good friend, to sum that up, our good friend Frank Vega has, and he just has an excellent way of just kind of cutting through all the crap and succinctly saying certain things. And the way he would say, I think what you're talking about, Julie, is he says, your policies shape your data, and your data shape your policies. And that's, that
virtuous cycle. Yeah.
Yep. Your data is telling you a story. You don't like the story. Well, you got to change the process that started it. But kind of speaking of that, you had a question that you mentioned before we went on air about how somebody had, there's a person who's allocated. I'm going to try and recreate the question, and then you answer it for me. Okay.
Okay.
There's a person who's allocated 50% of the time to a team. And so when they're allocated to the team, they'll pick up something, they'll start working on it. But then they get pulled off because, the 50% time expires and they have to go do their other 50% somewhere else. But the thing they're working on is still in progress, or, it's not finished. Let's just say it's not finished. What do we do with that thing? Do we move it back to the backlog? Do we not mark it active no more?
Do we try to clean it up and make it pretty? And that was actually the question. It was a very good question, well thought out. And the person that asked, they answered their own question, and we were just there to sort of help them realize that was okay to do. But yeah, so this person, I think they were even just a 50%, like a part-time employee. So they weren't even there the other half of the time. So there was no option to have them be 100% focused. So we can just remove that off the table as an option. And so they asked, should we pretty it up? And, keeping it active makes it look messy, and things are aging and stuff. And then they said themselves, on the other hand, it's telling us how long it actually takes to deliver that item. And when my support team wrote back, I didn't even have to, they're flow gurus by now. They basically said, you had it right yourself when you said, on the other hand, it's telling us how long it takes to get work done. And that's what we want to maximize. Unless you're going to be punished, and even then I hope you're not, and I hope that you could show the truth anyway. We want the data to show the truth, because if we're hiding things and making things prettier, then we're not going to be fixing the things that we're not going to get the signals of the things that we need to fix. And all these visual systems that we build, like Kanban boards and things like that, they're meant to give us visual signals. So if we try to pretty them up, we do ourselves a disservice because we don't get the signals. And from a business standpoint, it's more important to the business to know how long that thing actually takes than to have accurate data on the actual touch time. I know that's a real term. I'm just using the, generic, the time someone was actually working on it. Like the overall time to value is much more important than the flow efficiency of that one piece of work. So we don't need to worry about making that, the active, to even worry about whether we're showing active versus, waiting time on it, as much as first we need to worry about optimizing it. And then we can look into start, looking at the deep pieces of that. So basically that was it. They answered their own question. We said, don't try to make it pretty, try to make it truthful and giving you the signal that will move your company's business goals forward. I haven't really seen many business goals, maybe consulting firms who work on build time, then they want to have build time be super accurate. But if you're working on delivering things, no matter what they are, then, that's what you need to visualize. And the other stuff is sort of a backseat, secondary visualization. Because I like to look at a Kanban board or any visual system as a design challenge. And I think about the most visible things on that as possible, and those need to show the most important things. So that's why the columns generally show how work moves through and its progression from start to finish, because that's how we visualize flow through the process. And then the cards themselves are items. And then when you are, and that's the thing we're trying to optimize for through that process. And then any other thing we're trying to talk about, whether it's if it gets blocked or someone isn't working on it for some other reason or anything like that, we have to think about what is that kind of signal really, and where does it belong on the board, and stuff like that. That's where I can geek out all day. I started doing a workshop on workflows and workflow design, and I'm going to try to take that to an at your own pace thing on the community site to give people a little bit of a walkthrough of how to do the mental model of thinking through that. But yeah, if you think of it like a design challenge and you really think, what signals am I trying to get out of this visual, then you'll probably be moving in the right direction with whatever choices you make about the design and the policies, because the policies are designed as well. It's part of the overall design of your process. And I'm just a talker today. I start and I keep rolling. And I wanted to throw out there again, Q&A, please enter it. No one's left and there's no Q&A. So I'm thinking people are really liking what we're seeing, but please put one in there if you've got one.
Yeah, we would certainly love to talk more about the things that you want to talk about. There are a couple topics that just came up that we can spend a little bit more time on. But please, if you do have any questions, let us know. So the one thing in particular, I don't know if we want to circle back on it now or not, but the whole prioritization conversation and how that affects our ability to achieve predictable flow, or how it does not affect our ability to achieve predictable flow. That's a topic that we could talk about. If anybody wants to, we'll maybe start with that, but if anybody wants to hear more, let us know, or anything particular. Something that Pratik and I have been talking about a lot lately is fixed length time boxes and how those help or hurt flow. If anybody wants to talk more about that. So should we start with kind of the prioritization one and see what happens, or
let's start with the fixed length flow, fixed length time boxes, and then maybe move to the prioritization unless we get sidetracked. Because so now I'm thinking back to when I was a manager in the IT department at F5 Networks in Seattle. And I was teaching people about flow. I was sort of agnostic to Scrum. I was using Scrum and things like that, but just iterations in general and their role in impacting flow. I was teaching people about it. And the biggest argument for the time boxes, like, just put aside the purpose of the Scrum framework itself, just time boxes in general. So I'm not necessarily talking about sprints, but time boxes is that it imbued a sense of urgency on people to not slow down and have, not attrition, but what is it? I can't think of the right word, where you're slowing down without realizing it, and then you come to a stop, that kind of thing. You're idling, you took your foot off the gas.
Yeah. This is where I always start my time box conversations this way. The problem with the time boxes is not the length, although it kind of is. The problem is more the arbitrariness of them. So it's like when you set a fixed length time box, how do you know 14 days is the right length? How do you know that 30 days is the right length? How do you know that 7.38624 days is the right length? And this is I know it's not because I just wrote the book, variation is at the top of my mind, but this is again where, I think some understanding of variation is essential, because if you acknowledge and if you understand that our process is variable, and our data is variable, then trying to shove something that's variable and something that's fixed length is going to be prime for disaster. There are bad things that are going to happen there. Not least of which is, as Julie was kind of saying, well, we've got this 14-day time box, and we're either doing whatever we can, and we got this sense of urgency. We got to make sure we get everything done by the 14 days. Well, maybe you've designed a process that you just can't do that, right? And now you're killing your team for something that was arbitrarily and artificially set. Or likewise, maybe you get done your work very, very, very quickly. And it's like, you're just kind of twiddling your thumbs. And I know this never happens, but it's possible, right? Waiting for the time box to expire so we can start something new, because God forbid we start something before the time box finishes and then we don't get that thing done, right? So this is, you can see how, all of that would lead to a lot of what I would argue is noise and waste in your process. Which is why in a flow world, we advocate more for some things like service level expectations around, hey, probabilistically, how long do we expect items to flow through our process, and really kind of manage our process based on aging relative to that service level expectation. And if we don't like either of those things, well, we got to change our process. It's not because we didn't get stuff done in this 14 days. It's like, well, our SLE is telling us such and such. Our variation is telling us such and such. Right? So that's what I would say to the whole time box thing.
Yeah. Do you think that there's still value in cadence, even if you're not working towards a time box?
Potentially, yes, and that's I'm really glad you brought that up, because to me there's a huge difference between cadence and time boxes. I know it always sounds like I'm bashing Scrum, and I kind of am, but I don't really mean to.
It's just the only example that comes to mind easily of a time box. So
yeah. The problem with Scrum is not, it's not the cadence of the events. It's that all those cadences are coupled together into a single arbitrary, artificial, fixed length time box. Again, if we embrace variation, each one of those cadences should be allowed to vary to its natural frequency. So if it makes sense to do retrospectives every 2 weeks, then do them every 2 weeks. If it makes sense to do reviews every 3 weeks, then do reviews every 3 weeks. If it makes sense to do planning every week, then do planning every week. Don't couple them, tightly couple them all together into, a single event, because again, that's where the waste and the noise is going to come from.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And just for everyone to know, Dan was for a long time, and you're focusing on other things right now, a Scrum trainer, primarily for teaching flow in Scrum teams. And so am I still. So we don't hate Scrum or anything, even if it ever sounds like that. Just know that we don't. I'm wondering, I did want to ask you, because we have been in our part of scrum.org. So we've been there when the Scrum guide was being changed, and we know it's gone through many changes over time. So over time, there's been this understanding that the time box needs to be divorced from delivery cadence, right? And so now it's moved much more towards being able to achieve some sort of user outcome or goal for the product as a whole by the end of that time box, even if individual work items are starting and finishing cross borders of sprints. Do you feel like that makes a material change in, if people are utilizing the by the book version of Scrum, which we know, doesn't always happen? Do you feel like if they really embrace that part, the decoupling of the delivery cadence from everything else, does that in your mind remove some of the harm to flow not harm, but just harm to flow for people using those sprints as time boxes?
Oh yeah. I mean, for sure. I mean, no doubt. I mean, when I first read the 2017 version of the Scrum Guide, and that was the first time I didn't even know there was such a thing as a Scrum Guide before that. And even when I knew that there was a Scrum Guide, I never bothered to read it. So as Julia said, when we started on with Scrum.org, I was like, you know what, I better go read this.
Probably should read it.
And I have to say, I was I was impressed by how much that document read like a flow document, right? If I didn't know anything about Scrum and I was just reading this thing, it read like a flow document to me. The next version of the guide, that's a different story and
Yeah.
a potentially different debate. But in 2017, I was just really impressed. But to Julie's point, there's still just a couple things in there that's like, yeah.
Yeah.
And when you dig into Scrum and you understand kind of the intentions, yes, the intention was never that you wait till the absolute last day of the sprint to
Yeah.
release everything, and that was never, as far as I know, that was never the
Yeah.
intent. It certainly isn't the intent now, if it ever was, in the past. And so to your point, Joe, absolutely, yeah, removing that kind of artificial understanding of that's what Scrum is, definitely would improve flow. There's still some niggling things in the Scrum guide that kind of, the whole idea of anything that's still in progress at the end of the sprint, you got to move back to the product backlog for reprioritization and things. It's like, really? Because those are the things that are really, really disruptive to flow. The idea that you have to empty out your sprint and then refill it. I mean, that you want to talk about wasteful and inefficient.
Yeah.
So
We
if you're
don't do that, by the way. With my product teams, we are, I mean, we're not actually doing Scrum by the book, but when things roll over from sprint to sprint, they don't go back to the backlog. They stay in status so that we can get flow metrics on those. So if I can't even remember if that's in there, but if it's in there, we're breaking it, and we continue to be proud breakers of that rule.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Go ahead.
That was good. And I think you have something in your book that talks about if you want to do time boxes, at least look at the voice of your process, the outcomes, like how long it's taking you to finish work, and use that to help set the length of your time boxes, right? So if your cycle times are 21 days or less 85% of the time, maybe don't pick 7 days as a sprint, or maybe not even 14, maybe 3 weeks. 3 weeks is, still within the, guidelines of trying to help you not do extremely large batches, right? So I think there's good advice in your book for teams who want to continue doing time boxes for whatever reason, and how to use your flow metrics to help inform the right size of time box, which is what you sort of started with, is that the amount of time we chose is often 14 days because everyone does 14 days, right? Not for any other reason, not for any empirical reason where we think our process can support that time frame. And oftentimes to be in sync with everyone else. Everyone in the company is going to have 14-day sprints so that we can all get on the same trains and all that stuff, So it's good to understand that your process, when you're inspecting and adapting your process, part of that, if you're a Scrum team, should be the length of your sprint. And so you can use flow data to help you improve your Scrum practice as well. So no, that's really, really cool. Did you have any other, let's do a quick talk about prioritization, and then we'll do some call to actions here. Let people know how to keep up with the community only events that might be coming up.
Yeah, I don't prioritization in 25 words or less. I don't know if I can do that. Maybe you and I should go off and think about for the next one, what are some prioritization, but some questions I would ask about prioritization, maybe to kind of get the ball rolling. And we can do a deeper dive next time. But it's like, what do you think prioritization is really gaining you? Think about, the time between when you start something and then when you start the next thing. What has changed? When you finish. Maybe I should take a step back. I'm always assuming, whenever we talk about prioritization, I'm always assuming that you're doing it in a WIP limited environment. Because if you're doing prioritization outside of a WIP limited environment, then you absolutely are wasting your time. Because obviously, if your WIP's not limited, then the highest priority thing should always be started, right? The highest priority thing. It's the highest priority. Let's start it. Oh, it's the highest priority. Let's start it. It's the highest priority, right? So prioritization really only makes sense in a WIP limited environment. Even then, though, you should talk about, so that means that you're not starting something until you finish something. Well, the time it takes between something, between you're starting those things, what have you learned? Has a business environment changed? Has, when we finished this thing, we realized, hey, we thought this was important, but now this other thing is important, has COVID happened or something. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can happen in between prioritization, which is why, and again, this is something I think we can go into much more detail maybe at some other time, why I'm generally against, especially big upfront prioritization conversations, because that stuff should really happen just in time. When you're prioritizing a backlog of 10, 20, 50, 100, whatever items, you're wasting your time because things change so much.
Mm-hmm.
You should just wait until you have that signal that we're ready to start something, and then talk about just in time, what's the next thing we should work on.
Absolutely. I mean, I actually talked to an ActionableAgile customer last week in Gothenburg here in Sweden, and she came up to me and told me that they have been using ActionableAgile to help teams understand that they're doing too much refinement too early. And so they're spending all this time refining a bunch of things that, are going to either take forever to get started, may never get started by the time, to your point, that we learn about the things that have gone through our process. And so she wanted them to right size the amount of refinement that they're doing to free up time to do something that will add more immediate value. And I think ever since I've been learning about Kanban from from when I started with the Kanban method, that's always been sort of a key component of what I learned, is that we want to do lots of things just in time, including doing anything in the options list or the backlog or whatever we talk about. Like when I started at Turner Broadcasting, we would have a column of up next, and we would only figure out, like, say if we had 5 things in there, it would be some amalgam of how often I would have access to people who had some input. Whether or not that input would be valuable is a whole different question. And then how fast we finish work. So we put a WIP limit on that up next column to account for that amount of work. And then that's the amount that we bothered thinking about. Like, so only if it's 5, only bother thinking about the next 5 things that we want to put into our system. And I think it's worth tying back to forecasting, because when you do a Monte Carlo forecast, it's not telling you when you'll finish those items that you actually care about. It's telling you when you're going to finish the next X items that come out of your system. And it's up to us to make sure that those items, this is what Pratik told me once, it's up to you to make sure the items that come into and thus exit your system are the ones that matter. And so while there is, there's, depending on how you're doing it, what you're doing, and why you think you're doing it, prioritization may not be as useful for you as you think. But like if you're trying to finish an epic, let's say, then you might want to think about, instead of like spreading your focus across a whole bunch of random work, focusing on finishing those items. And that's the sort of prioritization, is prioritizing finishing efforts that have started before starting new efforts. So that level of prioritization is good. But if you're looking at which overall efforts to start, your sort of mileage may vary, because I think part of what you're saying too is that we assume that we have good inputs to answer that question, but oftentimes our inputs are so wrong. Like, what's the real value of this? How long will it really take? And with the how long it will take, hopefully you can use your data to get better at that. But like the cost of delay, cost of not doing something versus the value of doing it, all we can do is give our best guess. And then that's only useful if we continually see if we're anywhere near right, and there's a way to get better at that. But then to your point, what I would anticipate that you would say is, that's all great, but that's going into building a better mousetrap, instead of just make things small, do things fast, and you'll get more value over time than if you tried to have the best prioritization model. Is that a good sum up
That's
of what
very, yeah,
you and
very, yeah,
Pratik say?
very, yeah, very, very, yeah, an excellent, yes, excellent sum up, right? Yeah. So,
Okay, cool. Well, we did get one question, and so I'm going to actually share. Dan, is it okay if I share your Lean Pub page?
of
Okay.
course, please, yeah. I haven't even looked at it. So yeah, there it is.
So
I pushed publish this morning, and I didn't even go to check and make sure that
you were
everything was
probably
good.
like the first people to see this. So Dan's new book is Actionable Agile Metrics Volume 2. It's sort of like the the Guardians of the Galaxy, volume 2. And these are advanced topics. So do you just want to give a high level of which advanced topics, which things should they expect to read in this book?
Yeah,
Read about?
absolutely. Yeah. So the first book was all about, kind of dictating. This is the data you should collect, and these are how you calculate the metrics based off this data. And I went into a little bit about how to interpret that data, but maybe not so much as I would have liked. And that's the first part. The first section of this book is trying to fix that problem. Is when you're presented with a set of data, how do you interpret it? How do you know? Essentially, to kind of give you the punchline, how do you know what's signal, things that you should be acting on versus what's noise? It's just the normal part of the process that it's like, you'll actually make things worse by acting on those things. So the first part of the book is, okay, you're presented with a data set. Hopefully you're looking at all the data that I told you to look at in the first book. All right, now how do we interpret it and how we take action on that for better predictability? And then the second part of the book is a bunch of advanced Monte Carlo simulation techniques that, again, in my second book, When Will It Be Done? I introduced the concept of Monte Carlo simulation, but just very kind of basic. This is how you do a basic Monte Carlo simulation. Well, it turns out, obviously, in the real world, there are a whole bunch of other things that you need to consider. You need to consider things like, what happens if we have a bunch of dependencies? What happens if we're trying to, what happens if we're in a situation where we're breaking epics down into features and features down into stories, and we want to be able to forecast at every level of those, right? There's a whole bunch of nuance that can go on in terms of how you forecast for, those different types of scenarios. And that's what we get into a lot more detail about in the second part of the book. So you can think of this volume 2 as just kind of an amalgamation of things that I wanted to write about before, but just couldn't fit into the first two books I've written. And so hence we have this one.
Yeah. And, in reading this book, I can think of at least a couple of customer questions that I've answered about the difference in forecasting like epics with a cycle time and versus forecasting them based on the amount of stuff inside of them. I think now I'm armed with better answers to that, having read this book. So this is a good example of, no matter how much you think you know about something, there's always something to learn, because I learned a lot of stuff in this book. And to bring it back to a product angle, there's a lot of value that if you're using Actionable Agile, it's going to just deepen your ability to get value out of the product by understanding a little bit more what the tools are especially good for and how to use them effectively, understanding your process and your data. Because as much as I can and my team can help people click, but know the right button to click in right situations, there's an art that goes beyond customer support for really turning your team into what you want it to be when using analytics. And so we try to answer every question, but this is a really great tool that we're going to be leaning on this book to help answer people's questions and show them a place where they can even go deeper on those answers. Also, Portfolio Forecaster is an application, a product that we currently have in Jira. We are about to release I would say, in the next quarter or two, we're going to be releasing just a brand new imagining of the ability to do this advanced feature Monte Carlo kind of simulation that Dan talks about in this book, when you're not just trying to forecast one effort, but multiple efforts at the same time, given that you're working on multiple, that your WIP could be 5 efforts at a time, 10 efforts at a time. What happens if I do this or that or the other thing? And how can I look and see how we've moved the needle on our forecast based on how we've improved what we've done so far, and all these great things. And then being able to look at it at the forecast level, and then also at for a team, and then also at a wider portfolio level. And we thought we knew how we were going to do the portfolio level until we continued learning from Dan and Pratik. And there, just a few weeks ago, or maybe even sooner than that, we talked lately to them, and we think we have a way to even highlight dependencies better than we had thought we would be able to do in the tool. And so it's just there's a whole future there for that product that we're super excited about. And I think you'll get excited about that option too when you read this book. And even though we're going to be starting with it in Jira, it is our hope to bring it over to Azure DevOps and, potentially other places as well. I wanted to sort of round us out by having everyone being aware of community.55degrees.se. You may have found out about this event by being in the community. You see that you can come here and learn things about our company as a whole, our products that we deliver, where we are. Here's how we're talking about, here's where we're talking about things like our security compliances and whatnot. But then we also have a space where you can come talk to other people interested in the same products, using the same products, but also in those people who are using this product, Actionable Agile, are also going to be talking about flow, predictability, forecasting. So it's another place to come and to find out and talk to other users trying to do the same things you're doing. We're also there, but we want you to talk to each other as much as we want to be able to converse with you there. So if you join our community, you're going to see a new event in the next couple of days. That's going to be a community-only event. So you'll need to join the community to come to this premium webinar with Dan about, it's his sort of, we're launching this book webinar on November the 15th. So that should be popping in anytime soon. And you'll only see it here. So there'll be another chance for you, hopefully after you've had time to read a bit of it, if not all of it, to come and ask the deep questions. He'll prep really hard to be ready for you. If you have any questions about any of our products or anything, you can ask us here on the community. You can also go to support.55degrees.se and we'll be here. And please feel free to reach out to Dan and myself directly on social media, where we could talk about this stuff all day and twice on Sunday. So feel free to come on over. Dan, do you have any other closing thoughts?
No, just looking forward to hearing, if anybody goes out and buys a book, just looking forward to hearing your feedback. This is one of the advantages of being, as Julia mentioned, being able to publish on LeanPub, is if you give me some feedback, I've got an opportunity to change the book a little bit, to make it better for the audience. Once we go to print, that becomes a bit harder.
Yes.
But would love your feedback, and certainly would love, certainly love your interest in the second book. So, or third book, I guess, technically, second volume.
It is.
So thanks, everyone.
Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability, Volume 1. Then you've got When Will It Be Done? Great book. And then this Volume 2, Advanced Topics. So get through all three, you're an expert. So are very close to being on your way to that. So thank you everyone for your time. Thank you so much, Dan, for joining us as always. And we look forward to talking to you in our community on socials or at the next webinar. See you soon.
Thanks, Julia.
Bye.
Thanks to the team at 55 Degrees. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks. Have a great week.
Bye.